Moyer.
Oh,
Yeah, it's Moyer.
Who are you? I'm sure I need my parents.
Before you give you 9.
Little cases.
I'm sorry, but I need backup IT. For what? For our presentation.
Oh, I thought you were looking at me. It's like, boy, that's a mistake.
No, my God, Daniel's not here. He's on the TV.
Did you control it from? Yes, I got it. All right, let's see who's so Daniel.
That.
Let's see. Hey. Okay, and, this is class 2. Just out of curiosity, does everyone still have their handout from last week?
Yes.
Okay, we're gonna pick up somewhat where we left off. So if you don't, I have a couple extra copies. But yeah, let's go ahead and go back. There's a couple things I want to go over before we.
Can I have one of those copies?
Remember, I told you.
I have it, it's not on me.
I also have it, but it's not on my person.
Oh, okay. Well, that makes it right.
I don't have it because I was online.
You could have just said you had it and just stared at the, down out of it, by the way. So. If you're already in your 3rd year, you should have learned these tricks. Did you brief that case? Yes. Do you have it? No.
Yeah, hold
Yes.
on, it's in my packet.
Maybe. What do you want me to tell you?
Yes, but I will need co-counsel.
I agree with whatever what's his name said. I concur. Try that sometimes. All right. So who just?
Brian.
Oh, okay. It's like I just thought for a minute there that everybody was in the room at the same time. My mistake. Okay. Anyways, what I'd like to do is go ahead and jump ahead on the first handout to constitutional limits, cases, and controversies. The other readings on the earlier court cases, basically what they tell you is just that, you remember we stopped with Marbury versus Madison, right? And so what the other cases basically tell you is that it took a little while, kind of, again, a process, but at a certain point, the Supreme Court was also making decisions for the state courts. They were also making decisions in different kinds of areas. So basically the rest of that part tells you about how they basically just hauled in everybody. Okay, so now they make decisions for everybody. Because again, remember the original Constitution did not apply to the states. But because of, again, of decisions by the Supreme Court and John Marshall, like magic, they did. There you go. Very interesting stuff indeed. So what I'd like to do today is go ahead to this. It's, I think, in section F, because we do have to talk about constitutional limits. It's actually fairly important. There's some things the court still can and cannot do. Now, with that said, I do reserve the first part of the class, as I mentioned, for any type of stories or any type of inquiry that you may wish to discuss at this time that has a constitutional basis.
Sotomayor's dissent today?
Oh, Sotomayor's dissent, very interesting, yes. How many of you saw the Sotomayor dissent this morning?
And Ginsburg by her side.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. The Supreme Court came out with a decision today, which basically upheld the Trump administration's total ban on allowing asylum seekers to actually come into the United States if they are in a second foreign country. So in other words, what they're trying to do, and again, again, part of it might be political, I don't know. But I prefer just to cut to the chase. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to stop persons from Central and South America, Mexico as well, I guess not really, because they're already in Mexico, from seeking asylum in the United States, because obviously nobody from Honduras or Guatemala or any of the states that they actually are coming from can go directly to the United States. Now, the Trump administration made a very interesting argument, though. I don't know how many of you caught this one. It's not a good argument, but it's a very interesting argument, I have to say. And their argument is, if you've already made it to a second country, what's your rush? That's kind of an interesting argument, actually. You keep telling us that you're coming here applying for asylum because you're being chased by gangs and drug members and, autocrats and death squads and, from blank, and yet you're no longer there. You're actually in another country that theoretically is not doing
You're not coming to us from the country you're claiming is doing
Right.
that to you, basically.
So what's your problem? You're actually,
You're already out of danger.
Right, so how do you qualify as as an emergency asylum seeker? Not the worst argument in the world. The problem is what? Anyone want to take a stab? One, it's stupid, but okay, besides that, that's fine. This is how they're going to come up here. They can't go back home. They're leaving their lives. They don't intend to stay in any second country. And believe it or not, under international law, they have a right to ask us. Okay, so it's a stupid, but it's interesting. Give them credit for trying. It's also a thinly veiled racism, which usually doesn't work too well as a basis. From time to time they get through. It doesn't usually work too well as a basis. But the Supreme Court, all 5 conservative justices, said that sounded really cool. And so they upheld the ban today. The lower court had said no. And so what the Supreme Court did was they removed the stay that was on the injunction that wasn't allowing the Trump administration to actually enforce this law. Now, interestingly enough, Sotomayor wrote a very, very interesting dissent, basically saying that this is the end of America as we know it. She makes some interesting points. You should read it. But you know, again, it's the type of thing is like, is this really what we do in America? That's what it breaks down to. Is this really the hallmark of America?
Is this why they put us in our position?
Yeah, exactly. And so it's talking about the breakdown of, you know, what it means to be American, which of course is an interesting question. You know, I mean, obviously, you can sit there and argue for years, you know, about what, you know, what makes, I mean, we know a lot of things about America. I mean, you can list them, you can say this, you can say that. Fill in the blanks all day long, you know, it's a history lesson, no problem. But one of the more interesting questions is what makes us exceptional, though? I mean, we claim that we as Americans are exceptional. I would argue we are. I would say America is an exceptional country. Everything even being equal, we're an exceptional country with an exceptional group of people. I would say that's true because, you know, you have to, no culture is going to be, don't get me started. I was actually watching some white supremacists last night, and it's like, they're making very silly arguments. Okay, so it's like, they're arguing against the homogenous nature of our country because that's not human nature. This is ridiculous. I mean, this is really very one-sided, just so you know, and very, you know, it's just not there for them. But anyways, but the thing is that one of the things that does make America unique is that we have managed to overcome blood and soil. Now, how many of you have ever heard that saying? Anyone know where it comes from? Yeah, I mean, you saw it in Charlottesville. Remember when they were walking down the streets there? See, you started this. Don't blame me. You started this. She started it, not me.
You asked for something that was like very big today, so.
Where's my gavel? Irrelevant. Anyways, you have to say, no, Professor Drucker, we want to get out of here today.
I think it's very relevant. We're in con law.
Then I will continue. I take it by all of your silence that you concur. Good. Let's move forward. Anyways, with that said, so blood and soil, which was what they were chanting in Charlottesville, if you might recall that. So it sort of came back into the news, was actually the Nazi chant. It was one of their very early chants. And what they were saying was that it was their soil, right? German soil belongs to Germans because we have German blood. So blood and, well, it's actually soil. Sorry about that. I'm thinking of something else. Anyways, but it's actually soil and blood, and that's what they were saying. German soil for Germans because we are German blood. Okay, so they're making that connection. Pretty interesting. Now, who on German soil doesn't have German blood? Out of curiosity. Among other people, but who would be a big group of persons that really do not have German blood? Well, that would be the Jews. So now you know where all that came from. It was actually a very early kind of program that was starting to, you know, turn people in the direction of where the country would go next. Okay, and that's where all this comes from. And so when I was watching, you know, the Charlottesville sort of tragedy, and I was, you know, very keen on watching, well, the whole thing, but certainly the part about where you had a group of white youths who were chanting soil and blood. I don't know if any of you saw that, but I saw that. And the interesting thing was, if you really, as you got more and more into it, this wasn't really spread through the media too much, but the other thing they were chanting was also from early Nazi Germany was, Jews will not replace us.
Oh, I did see that.
Yeah, so this is actually, you know, Nazism 101. And so, again, we would take it for whatever it's worth. But when President Trump comes out and says there's fine people on both sides, you know, I would kind of argue, I don't know any fine Nazis. I don't know if you do. Actually, I know Nazis. I do, strangely enough. So, and they'd like to see me go home. And what do I always tell them? I am home. I'm an American. This is where I come from. Because America is not a country of blood. You're not an American because you have American blood. That doesn't work. We're only 260 years old, and everybody that came over here to escape oppression in Europe or wherever else they came from basically does not have American blood. To my knowledge, there's only one group of people that have American blood, and that would be the Native Americans. So if we were a land of soil and blood, it would actually belong to the tribes, not us. So there you go, a big problem that we have in America. However, at the same time, we do have a group of persons who, whatever their basis is, are claiming that through so many generations of fill in the blank, that becomes American blood. They throw into it this thing about heritage that you hear a lot of. Any of you ever heard about that? Heritage or culture or something like that. They'll say, well, we're here to, why we are an exceptional country is about our culture. And so they'll say they're protecting American culture. Now, that's an interesting theory too. Again, there's lots of different theories you can look at. But the problem with that is that, America is, the whole point of it is that we take in all cultures. Mm-hmm. There's no really one culture. And the problem being is when you elevate worship of Confederate statues to culture, that's the problem, because if no other reason, they lost. I would like you to sort of point out, though, that I think that all of this plays into American exceptionalism. Now, you may be looking at me saying, how's that work? But what other country do you know that would even allow the losers of a civil war to build one statue, much less what we did, which is let them set up all that they basically wanted to for many, many years. And so that's one of the exceptional qualities of America, is that we do accept persons. We do allow them to speak. We do allow them to fill in the blank, whether we agree with it or not, to a great degree. Now, when they cross the lines, right, and they start to do, hateful things in the name of fill in the blank, or when they, take action, violence, whatever, that's where we draw the line, because that's no longer speech, that's no longer culture. Or it's part of the culture, but it's the bad part, it's the part you want to stop. And every country knows that. So that we would not be unique by allowing, white supremacist violence in the United States. That just wouldn't work. So we can back into that if you want, but that doesn't work, all right? I think we all agree with that. But again, when you look at America, this is what makes us exceptional, is that we take people in, is that we allow them to assimilate, but to be who they are. We don't turn them away because they're different. We try to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And that's the way it's always been. That's why, for instance, when people ask me, are you afraid of Muslims? No. I mean, not at all. First of all, I went to UCLA, which is half Muslim when I was there anyways, from Iran. So I knew plenty of them then. Then when I went to law school, half my class was Jewish Iranians who had fled from oppression, strangely enough. And they lived here just fine, and there were things about them that were, I guess kind of unique to them. They had some of their identity, but I'm telling you, they were as worst capitalists as we're ever going to be. Lots of stuff they liked about America, and they fit in just fine. I never had any trouble with them. I never heard of anybody having any trouble with them. And yet here they were, most of them were second generation at this point Americans, or they were very young when they were brought over here. And so I tell you truly that in America, to a great degree, and this was, believe it or not, my point, which also is plays into our class today, by the way, is that in America, how we define citizenship, how we define you are an American, it does have some blood to it, right? If you're born to Americans, then yes, you are an American. But but for many, many generations, that wasn't possible. So what makes you an American? What made the founding fathers American? None of them were born here. They couldn't have been born in America. There was no America. Well, it was territory. They were here. they were born in America, right? They were born in, well, North America, or they were born in the colonies. Therefore, when we became America, we took on, to be an American really means to be born within American territory. And I argue that the founding fathers were actually fairly clear about that, because if you read the requirements for president, there's only two. Does anyone know what the two are? Constitutional requirements for you to be president of the United States, there's only two. One is,
Be born in the US?
okay, one is you have to be born in the US or a territory of the US. You can't be born in a foreign country. Because they were afraid of like kings and princes bringing all their money and then installing their relatives. That's mostly why they did that. But also there's a rumor that nobody ever wanted Alexander Hamilton to be president, and he was born in the West Indies. He actually was not born in the United States. So he by definition was excluded from ever, if people always say, well, how come Alexander Hamilton never ran for president? And the answer is because he could not. He was constitutionally forbidden from doing so. And one of very few people that you could actually put your finger on and say could not. So could
Wow.
be true, who knows, right? But at the same time, you know, that's what we have as a country, where the other requirement, by the way, is that you are 35 years or older. So no, AOC could not be president right now, which is another question I heard the other day. She's going to have to wait a couple of years. You know? Youngest president is 42. It's been our youngest president. Just,
That was Obama, wasn't it?
yeah, Obama was our youngest president. Before him, it was JFK, who was 45, I believe. Yeah. So that's what makes, another thing that makes America America, is that in fact, you are an American because you were born here. Soil, territory. John McCain was born in Panama. How many of you know that? But he was born on a military base. So who owns the military base? We do. So he's an American citizen. And not to put it this way, but notice how Trump tried to stop that. Do you really think he's that petty? That because that would have gotten rid of John McCain? He tried to make it that territories didn't count. Okay, well, everyone said, let's move on. Thank heaven to that one. But anyways, again, an argument about territory, an argument about things like that. Very interesting, yeah. And so that's one of the things that makes the United States very unique. We're a country of territory. It also tells you something else that's a really interesting question as well, which I've been asked a lot lately, which is, do illegal immigrants, let's call them that for today, although I like undocumented workers, but even better, I like people who want a better life. Anyways, with that said, do they have any rights? And the answer is A, if they're on American soil, the answer is definitely yes. Okay, when you're in America, you have certain constitutional rights. Doesn't matter if you come from Antarctica. Everybody has certain rights simply because you are here. So notice how what's playing out at the border right now is the administration is trying to do anything it can to make sure that these persons do not make it onto their soil, because they know that too. So notice how they're constantly trying to keep everybody off of our soil, and everyone that's here they want to take out. The reason for that being is because once you're out, you have less rights. You have more rights when you're here than when you're not. It's just the nature of the beast, right? And so theoretically, you also have rights when you reach the border. Okay, you also have rights when you're being held, you know, seeking asylum and applying for asylum, right? Because all of a sudden you're under American custody, which means you have some rights. You have some due process rights. You have things of that nature. You just do. And so notice how, again, the administration has figured that out. And so they're trying to stop that as well. Now, interestingly enough, it became a hot button issue a couple of years ago. That's strangely how we know all of this now. Because who do you think were the persons that, you know, under no way, shape, or form did that administration ever want these people on American soil? What group of people would that be that actually is the reason why we still have something that you may not really think of it this way? But think about it, a couple years ago, not Obama's. What was going on before Obama? Oh, it was yesterday. So what was going on? What was yesterday?
Oh, 9/11.
Okay, yesterday was 9/11. What happened after 9/11?
Terrorist attacks.
Okay, we had a terrorist attack, and then what else? Did we catch any of them? Yes, we did. What did we do with them? Well, what did we do with them?
Murdered them.
No, most of them are still alive. I was actually just reading that. Most of the ones are still alive, but where are they?
Imprisoned them.
Where?
Guantanamo Bay.
Well, where? On
Yeah,
Guantanamo.
Guantanamo Bay.
Is Guantanamo in America? No.
Still have right.
Is there a difference between being in Guantanamo and being in New York City? Because some of the terrorists actually were caught in New York City. The answer is yes.
Yes.
Technically, if you're in New York City, you're entitled to what? A trial by a New York court. If you're in Guantanamo, are you entitled to a trial by a Guantanamo court? Sure, there's no such thing. So why not? Yeah, you can do that. Problem would be there's no Guantanamo court. Or if you did get a Guantanamo court, what would you get anyways? What do you think you would get? What kind of justice would you get? Well, you're on a military base. What do you get? You get a military tribunal. Just so happens that military tribunals are very, and we'll see this later in the class, we have quite a few cases on it. But military tribunals are multi-level. Some of them look more like real trials and actually have evidence and things like that. And some don't look like much of a trial at all, quite frankly. These are called battlefield trials, which usually means they caught you, they're pretty sure you're a traitor. They don't want to let you go because you'll just go back to fighting, so they shoot you. That was actually practiced by George Washington. He actually shot some of his deserters because he thought they were traitors as well, and would go back to the British side. So we have a long history of doing that, called these battlefield executions, things of that nature. Do you have any right to evidence? No. Do you have any right to counsel? No. And even if you did, there aren't any there. And so, basically back then, if they kept you alive, you were another mouth to feed, and that didn't go too well. Away you went. And Washington himself is rumored to have shot at least 2 deserters. Like himself. He thought he was just a nice guy. He was, but it's the way they rolled back then. Probably the way they roll today. But with that said, but it is. Wars, someone said to me the other day, war is a crime. I said, no, war is not a crime. Actually practicing war under our code of jurisprudence is not a crime. Now, if you commit war crimes, which happens every time there's war, by the way, there's no such thing as a war without war crimes. This is complete nonsense. So every time, they tell you they're going to have war, we're going to be in and out in, so many hours or something like that even, that's complete nonsense. And they're going to tell you that there aren't going to be any atrocities of war. That's complete nonsense. I mean, this is the package. This is what you get. You do that. So is war in and of itself a crime? The answer is no. However, are many atrocities guaranteed to happen when wars break out? The answer is yes. So about that as well. So my argument to you about making this all kind of circular, and then again, it's kind of making it relevant to some of today's reading anyway, is that this is one of the things that makes us unique. This is one of the things that make us an extraordinary country, is you gain rights by being on territory. Who else does that? Who does that? It's always blood first, blood this, blood that. Titles, the whole thing that comes from that. That's why we don't have titles in the United States. There's no sir, there's no lord, there's no any of those things, because theoretically those are supposed to show, bloodlines. Now it just so happens that in today's world, this is complete nonsense, just so you know. Because what happens is when persons, particularly around the 18th and 19th, the 1800s and the 1900s, all through Europe, when the nobility got poor, all of a sudden, particularly after World War I, when it wasn't much use for them anymore. One of the things that they would routinely do is sell their titles to someone who was not a woman. All of a sudden, that was okay. You didn't have to hold on to it and pass it down to your relatives or anything of that nature. So basically, what you did was you sold the household belongings, and you sold the house, and then you sold your title, and you ended up in some, if you were English, I guess you ended up in some second-story apartment in Brighton or something like that. But anyways, that's the way it is. And so really, in many, many ways, the idea of, just so you know, British royalty is stupid at this point. But, but it's fun. It is a lot of fun. So, lots of fun. I was actually there during when Prince Charles and Diana got married. I was actually in London at the time. I had no idea. I was just there and they were like, oh, Prince Charles is getting married to Diana. I'm like, who's that? Cool. So, and there's all these parades. Pretty great stuff. I don't know, I thought it was cool. Anyway. But, so that's how we do things here. One of the more interesting aspects, which is, again, talk more about this later, it's against the conversation. But one of the other also interesting things about American exceptionalism is, and this is what kind of makes now very difficult too, is although we started as a nation of isolation, this is true. We at first decided we were going to be an isolationist nation. The only reason we survived is because we had a big old ocean here and a big old ocean there. If it wasn't for that, we'd be here today, but we'd probably be a little after tea time, but we'd be Pacific tea mostly, if not something else, just so you know. But because
So all I do is sip tea.
oh, there you go. Is it Earl Grey by any chance?
No, it's not.
That would be the statement. But commoners would do like English. But anyways, yeah. But anyway, so we played on isolation because it helped us. And besides, back in those days, we couldn't help anyone anyways. We were constantly broke. I mean, the United States was in a constant state of bankruptcy until like the late 1800s. I mean, even if someone wanted us to help, we couldn't help them. We had no money. We were constantly broke. And, we really didn't took a long time for our economy to catch on, actually. Many, many years. And we were very, very poor country for a very long time. So isolation worked pretty good. We couldn't tell anybody anything. And the trade that we, even in those days, we understood it was better to buy American. And there were many, many different efforts back then to kind of try to get people not to buy goods from overseas and things of that nature. They were very expensive back then, so only the upper classes could afford them anyways, by the way. This idea that everyone in America had a Louis XIV, this is complete nonsense, okay? Complete nonsense. I don't know where people got that one from, but they were very, very expensive and very, very few Americans could afford anything from overseas. It was really super extra luxury item, something like that you would not have seen in everybody's homes. So buy American was actually a big deal back then, and buy American was actually a necessity back then. You couldn't afford it when it came over here anyway, quite frankly. So, that's how we kind of were doing for those many years. But ever since life goes forward and the world gets smaller and our influence grows, we've sort of stretched out into the world now, to the degree that before we entered World War II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt makes an amazing speech, which we may look at again later in this class. It actually answers the question for you when anybody says to you, what day did the United States become the policeman of the world? It was that speech where basically Franklin Delano Roosevelt in September, can't remember the actual day, but it's in September of 1940, basically gives a very famous speech called the Four Freedoms speech. And he says basically that everybody on this planet has 4 freedoms. Got it? Not in the United States. He ends it all by saying for the world. Everybody in this right has the right to, free speech, everyone has the right to freedom of economics, to be free from tyranny, and to be free religious stuff like that. So he gives you these 4 freedoms, but at the end of each freedom, he says, for the world, for the world. Therefore, we now have a basis to enter into World War II, which we didn't super have before that, to be honest with you. Of course, then came Pearl Harbor, and we had a great reason, but this is before that, yeah. And we certainly had no particularly good reason to, go after Germany at that point. I mean, it just wasn't a whole lot of reason. So we were fairly neutral, but things were changing. He gives this speech, now it gives us a basis, right? Almost on cue comes Pearl Harbor, and here we are. Now we're the policemen of the world. And so has said our president, one of our greatest presidents. So we assumed that mantle. And after World War II, we are in fact for a period of time, we are the only superpower left on the planet. We're it. Not because we were so super, to be honest with you, although we were pretty good. We certainly had the atomic bomb a couple of years before anybody did. But it wasn't so much that, it was that everybody else destroyed themselves. So we were the last man standing. And at that point, we are pretty much in control of the world. And so it also answers you one last question, and then we'll get on to this. But it also tells you why it is that we need to keep NATO. First of all, it's because we don't want to fight again, right, like they were back then. We don't want Europe to descend into fighting. It's not in our best interest. We don't want them to be threatened by Russia. That was a very tense time after the war. And quite frankly, who set up NATO anyways, and why does it work the way that it works? We did, because that's the way we wanted it. We wanted to have troops. Do you know we still have troops in German soil? You know that, right? Pursuant to the NATO treaty. We still have troops in Okinawa, pursuant to another treaty. We have troops everywhere. Why? Because they're scary. That's why, because we want to have troops there. It reminds everybody, and there's actually a lot of reasons for this. So when someone comes up and says, oh, we need to be isolationists again, do you understand what they're saying? Withdrawing all the troops or make people pay more for it? This is complete nonsense. I mean, it really is. I mean, if you want to pay more for it, that's one thing, I guess. Although they do from time to time, by the way. But this is the situation that we set up because it benefits us. Quite frankly, we don't care if we pay a penny to us. Why do we care? We don't care because the benefits are for us. NATO benefits us more than anybody else. And there's no amount of money that any of these states can pay us or not pay us that would actually change that. So this is completely crazy stuff we're seeing today. Again, isolationism is, yes, we were an isolationist nation, certainly up to World War I. There's no doubt in my mind, that's a true statement. We really didn't get along with people too well before that. But ever since the modern era has come, this is nonsense. And how would you do this anyway? How would you be an isolationist nation today anyways? There's only one that we know of, or there's two actually, but there's only one that we actually know of, and that's North Korea. And they don't even have electricity at night. Wait, you want to live with no electricity at night? That's what it means to not trade with the world now. It's just a nonsensical theory that makes certain people happy because, I don't know, they believe in tooth fairies, they believe in Santa Claus, and they believe that we're never going to run out of oil, apparently. They're all three are on the same level. They're all three are nonsense. Or maybe the tooth fairy, I don't know. But that's your best bet of the three, quite frankly. So this is what it is. This is what it means to live in this world right now. So all these things you hear, they all sound, or they do not sound, depends on who you are, but they may sound very good. They may sound very patriotic. They may sound very American. But these are the ideas that we gave up years and years and years ago. And that's part of the American extraordinary qualities we have, is we're a nation that looks forward. We don't look back very much. This is good. We don't rely on what our granddaddies did. This is a good thing. Not that they didn't do good things, but it gives us a really unique ability to forget the bad things as well and to move on. And that's a very American trait. If you go to certain parts of Europe, I was in where was I? Hungary not Hungary, well, Yugoslavia not too many years ago, and it was still Yugoslavia. And I got into a conversation with a couple of, what did you call people from Yugoslavia back then? Slavs? Yugos? No, Yugos were the cars. I don't know, those people from Yugoslavia. And we started to talk about when that part of Europe, and we're talking way, way long time ago, was actually overrun by Saladin and the Muslim Islam nation. You would think that this happened yesterday. And I'm looking at them and I'm saying, this happened over 400 years ago. You know that, right? Look around you. But to them, it was like,
You're still living it today.
you know, this person did this to my granddaddy's granddaddy's granddaddy. I don't know. One last story, and then we go on. When I was in high school, from time to time, I used to always I went to a very racially homogenous like high school where I was actually the minority of all things. And every so often I would have one of my African-American associates get on some kind of a tirade for whatever reason. I don't know. But that's just the way life is when you're a teenager anyway. And he decided that he was going to beat me up because my granddaddy's granddaddy owned slaves. And therefore, there's a very good possibility that my grandparents, I think that's right, probably owned slaves, and it could have been one of his relatives. And this happened more than once. This was a fairly common occurrence. And I kept telling them the same thing though. I'd be like, hold up. It's even back then, I was very, hold up, just so you know, my ancestors, my relatives did not come to Ellis Island until 1914, okay? They were in Russia, got it? And they were Jewish, and they were being oppressed by the Tsar, who gave them the opportunity to either stay and die or go and live. Guess which one they chose? So really, in many ways, brother, we have much in common. Fight for the power, and then I'd run like that. That's how I handled it.
Totally played that in my head. Hilarious.
Mm-hmm. Yep. There you go. Angela Davis. Yeah. Whatever came to mind. But that was pretty much it. So there you go. You know, history is kind of what it is. And so these are things that make America very unique, and it makes us very exceptional. You know, we have proven to the world that you don't have to be. You know, there was a theory many, many years, and you still hear it all the time, that, you know, that democracy can never work because democracy favors, what's the word I'm trying to think? It favors the opposite of how much, you know, it's it favors nationalism. That's it. It favors nationalism. That given their choices, people will pull together with people of their own kind. We have proven this is not true. That's one of the things that makes America so amazing. I mean, do all of you sit around all day saying, I wish everybody was like me? No, I'm unique. You don't want to, me anyway. That would be bad. Anyways, with that said, but we have proven this theory to be incorrect. And yet, you know, every so often you'll still see them pop up, this, that. It's just not true. It's not true, and it's historically, it's not true. But at least modern, we have proved that, you know, a nation can make decisions for itself, and it can make the decision to be inclusive, not exclusive. And this is American greatness. That's why we have equal protection laws. That's why we don't let the majority tyrannize the minority. Very rare. Not too many countries would do that, by the way. Most countries just say, yeah, get the biggest group together, get the biggest mob together, and it's called mob rules, right? A lot of countries do that. There you go. We don't do that here. We protect the minorities from the majority. Very unique place. But that's because we know that our strength lies in diversity. We honor that, and because of that, we are a great exceptional country. Yeah. Anyway. you all go in the hallway at the break.
Drucker's a socialist.
I hear that again. Oh my God, I'm not a socialist. I don't really believe socialism will work. I really do believe that, but remember that socialism is an economic system. It's not a political system. So people need to knock it off anyways. You know, you're a socialist Democrat. No, I'm a conservative. I believe in capitalism Democrat. Well, aren't they the same? Come over here when I hit you with a stick. How's that the same? I digress. With that said, all right, so any other questions and any other comments? Good class. By this point, most of my classes are going, tell us another story, Dad. All right, that means we're going to go over to the book then. Okay, rock and roll. Constitutional limits, case or controversy. Now this is actually really important, not only for this class, but it's also important for the bar as well. You have to know this for the bar. Not all the nonsense I just told you that you don't write on the bar. You don't get points for writing America's great. Thing. Yeah, try it, let me know. Anyways, what you do though is this is something you have to know for the bar. Okay, because these are called constitutional limits, or it's also called as a general term, justiciability. Okay, how many of you ever heard the term justiciability? All right, did you ever hear that in a civil procedure or anything? Justiciability, it's a general category. This is how all Supreme Court cases start. Okay, it's called, they have to prove that they actually have jurisdiction to hear it, right? And with the Supreme Court, they are basically an appellate court. They only have original jurisdiction. In other words, they can be a trial court, but it's only in a couple of different areas, very, very limited. The big one is always admiralty. Believe it or not, admiralty cases are usually heard in the Supreme Court because they affect a lot of people. They affect shipping, and they affect things like limits of our territory. So that's why they hear those. They can also hear, of course, disputes among states. Makes good sense. You know, Alabama's in a fight with Missouri. Okay, well, which court are you going to be in? Alabama. Sure. I don't think Missouri would go for that, nor would Missouri follow Alabama's ruling anyway, quite frankly. So that would. So in cases like that, they go to the Supreme Court. They can actually act as a trial court. But for the most part, they actually act as an appellate court. So about 99% plus of their cases come through appellate. Okay, so keep that in mind, that this jurisdiction is as an appellate court for the most time. But because they're an Article 3 court, they have to also conform to certain requirements of the Constitution that are pretty much directed at them. You know, it's like, in other words, the Supreme Court will do this ahead of this thing. And these are called justiciability. So you've got to figure out what they can and cannot hear. There's some cases they can, there's some they cannot. Now the interesting thing is if you read the Constitution, it says that they can hear cases and controversies that arise under the Constitution. Sounds fair. Cases and controversies that arise under the Constitution. All right, what does that mean? What is a case? What's a case? For purposes of anything. I mean, again, you should get used to this. When we look at constitutional law, we're going to talk about words because that's how it works. In other words, you'll see a sentence, but there'll always be a word or two words. That's what they fight about. So you read, okay, the answer about justiciability basically is cases and controversies under the Constitution. It sounds easy, right? It's not. It's actually quite complex because now you have to tell me what is a case. Okay, it seems to me the easy way would say a plaintiff and a defendant, something that arises under law. What else would you say a case is? Right. Anything else? I'm just curious. There's no action in one particular answer. I mean, you all know what a case is, even if it's law school. But I mean, have you ever tried case? Nobody wants to try to.
I would say to opposing parties have different views on an issue.
Fair enough. Okay, that's pretty good. I'll buy that.
A legal dispute.
Please from the screen, someone trying to talk.
A legal dispute or a claim.
Okay, something probably that arises under law. Cognizable, like that. You can have a lot of problems in your life, right? Most of them are not legal. So maybe something that's more cognizable under that. But we all know what a case is, but it's curious, isn't it? It's not so easy to put that in words. In constitutional law, you must be able to do that. Now, of course, you also have to look at it within the context of the Constitution and probably the history of the time, you know, all sorts of stuff. We'll see about all that later. But, you know, just heads up, this is what con law is like. Okay, that's what makes it hard. Because all of a sudden you have to what? You have to think, and you have to put it in terms that people can almost understand. The only people that don't have to think and the only people that don't have to really actually understand or tell you in common language is the Supreme Court. Apparently they've lost that ability. But then again, they're already there for life, so why would they care? What the hell, you can't fire me. Yeah, lifetime appointment. That's my kind of job. Another government job, I'm telling you. Anyways, what about a controversy? What do you think that means? Okay, so we know a case is probably something to do with a legality. You know, problem two people have that is legally cognizable. That's pretty good. But what about this idea of a controversy? What do you think that means? What does that mean? Because that actually has a more specific meaning for the Supreme Court. A controversy. It actually.
Differences in opinion?
A what?
Differences in opinion?
Okay, a difference of opinion, reasonable difference of opinion, I'd say even, maybe. But what else? What makes it a controversy that the court can hear it? Because there's lots of controversies you go through every day, the court can't
That it
hear
affects
it.
a lot of people.
That helps. That actually does help. But no. Okay, that's how you kind of know it's a controversy.
Okay, what about differences in interpretation of the law?
That's more like a case. That's more like the law. There's law they'll be looking at, things like that. But a controversy really means what? It actually means a couple of things, but one is that it's ongoing. It's a controversy. It hasn't stopped, right? So in other words, if the Supreme Court does take this case, because it is a case, then they have to be able to fashion a remedy. It's a controversy for which there is a legal remedy. If there's no legal remedy, why are they hearing it? So, if it is not a case in a controversy, meaning there's a legal issue, they are capable of forming a legal remedy that solves the problem, right? In other words, they're litigating the rights of the parties to a conclusion which will favor one, favor the other, favor both, right? Because if they're not doing that, what are they doing?
Nothing.
Nothing. It's called an advisory opinion. They cannot issue advisory opinions. They can't say, well, if this was really a problem, if this was really a controversy, if this was really a case, we would say this. They can't actually do that. It has to be something that's legally cognizable of law, which they can form a remedy that will resolve the rights of the parties.
Basically, there has to be a problem for them to solve.
Yes. For which they can fashion a remedy. Yes. Otherwise, they can't hear it. It's just an advisory opinion. And that they can't do. So that's one of the biggest ones. The second requirement they have on this, and it all comes out of cases and controversies. Can you believe that? Those two words, everything we're going to talk about in the next 10, 15 minutes. Remarkable. Mootness. Anyone know what mootness is? Kind of tells you right there.
It is a real controversy. It says a real controversy must exist at all stages of review. Exception. Okay,
There are some exceptions. But so in other words, there has to be an ongoing controversy. It can't have already been solved. They can't say, oh, but we wanted to hear that because we were going to show you our legal genius again. I had a really good opinion that I was going to write. Good for you, they settled it. Unless there are some exceptions. One of them being is that it may actually affect a lot of people. So it's a big item, right? So something maybe the court wants to hear again because it might what? Or probably will. Probably what?
Repeat.
Probably come up again, right? So why don't we just solve it now before it comes up again? I mean, you do realize that every time the court makes a decision in an abortion case, they take more than 9 months. So isn't the case moot? Yes, that actual simple issue is moot. However, it's the type of case that evades justiciability because of its time limits, and it is certainly capable of repetition. And one of the ways that you also know it's kind of Supreme Court ready is it affects a lot of people. And those are the things you look at. Otherwise, it's probably moot. Yeah, they probably can't hear it. So now we already have two requirements, sort of this broad, and this is all just, these are all just issues of jurisdiction. So they're all just what? Civil procedure questions, but it's for the Supreme Court. So of course it's got layer on layer, right? I mean, we wouldn't want them wasting their time. You know, 2 times at 1 in Washington, you know. And I don't mean sipping tea. Okay, what about this one here? There's another requirement called rightness. What do you think that means? And all these appear on the bar, by the way, in essays and on multis for sure. They're going to ask you questions about this. They love to ask questions about this. What does that mean, ripeness? They can't hear the case unless it's ripe. Think. I'm not gonna give you all the answers. This is like, this is the 17th year I'm teaching this class. You tell me something. Sorry.
Well, just going off of
Think
your,
of names. And someone other than Melissa.
nobody's talking.
Come on. There's 4 or 5 of you in this class. There are no wrong answers in con law. You're not supposed to know the answers. I got news for you. Even I don't know all the answers. You're gonna see me say, I don't know. Well, what do you mean you don't know? You're an expert. That's why I don't know. Smart enough to know when I don't know. I'm gonna tell you what the court's gonna do. This court?
Based on the definition, it's almost like,
Missing the debate for you guys.
just based on the definition, I would say that rightness is just like someone has to suffer some sort of damage.
Well, yes, very good. The person who's claiming the injury actually has to be either injured or has to be an imminent threat of injury. It can't be about something that may happen way down the road. But remember that when I say that, rights are very unique. So many times, let's say you haven't been charged with a civil rights violation, but the person who was next to you at the protest was, right? And you did the same thing and they know who you are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When it comes to rights, is that imminent enough? That is. That's imminent enough. You don't actually have to be charged. You just have to be sort of, looks more or less like, you know, not even that you will. Will is not the standard, but could. Because again, we're dealing with rights. So if the court has the chance to, you know, litigate these rights and to explain these rights, they're going to take it. Okay, so again, rightness, you don't have to wait till you're actually charged with something, particularly under like civil rights statutes. It's fine that you may be subject to them. You can actually go to court at that point. So that's the rightness requirement in the short version, but the actual person suffering, bringing the suit must have actually suffered the injury, or they must be an imminent threat of being subject to the injury. And with rights, it's mostly just being charged, right? You don't have to be in jail, right, at that point. It's way before that. Got it? All right. Since we talked about Marbury versus Madison last week, this might make a little more sense to you. But one of the other things that they cannot hear is what's called a political question. What do you think that means? Especially after last week's lesson. What do you think political question means? Well,
well, then it's not something that can be like an issue of the Constitution, it's just more like a political issue. Like an issue that,
Okay, but what does that mean? That's circular logic. I can't hear a political issue because it's political. Okay, this is,
okay,
just so we're clear, this is typical con law thinking. The Supreme Court was right because they decided that way. Never said that to me. It's circular logic. But that's cool. This is where everybody starts. I used to scream at my professor because I used to say that. Well, what do you mean the law is right? It's whatever the court says and that's what they said. And so he basically throw things at me. But I learned too. Well, yes, Mr. Bryan.
Well, it means that it loses certain bias to the question. It's steering to one side of the issue instead of something that can be remedied. Sorry, I'm getting lost here, but yeah, I think it's pretty biased instead of a question oneself.
Okay, that's okay. But there's other stuff too. But that's okay. That's true. That's part of it. I'll buy that. What else? I mean, what does it sound like? Let's say that the Congress and the president are having a problem. Do you really think the Supreme Court should step in like they did Marbury versus Madison? Today they probably wouldn't. Why? Because it's a political question. There's two things that they should work out, right? I mean, they have certain powers and they have certain powers, and you two need to work it out. This is something that you're supposed to do, not us. So today, they probably wouldn't even hear that case. If it came up, they'd say, no, you two have to figure it out. That's a political question. In other words, what you're looking at as a practical matter is there are certain issues that are just reserved to the Constitution, to the other branches that do not appear under Article 3, which tells you what the courts do. So if that's true, they can't do that. It also happens with states' rights from time to time, right? Sometimes the states have certain rights that are reserved to them under the 10th Amendment, and the Supreme Court cannot hear them because it's a political question, and it has to be worked out among the litigants and things like that. So that happens from time to time. Yeah.
Like
There are
redistricting?
just some political questions that are inherently incapable of judicial resolution. Now, this is really interesting because if you think about it, there's some cases that are inherently incapable of judicial resolution. And most of the time you don't hear that one. But now they're starting to throw this one around more. Why? Again, think about politics and things about that. What would that mean as a practical matter?
Can you repeat the phrase?
I'm sorry?
Can you repeat the phrase?
Oh, yeah. The question is a political question that is inherently incapable of judicial resolution.
Oh, judicial resolution.
Yes, I mean, in other words, what do you think that means though? I mean, it actually means something fairly specific, believe it or not. Although there may be many variations, but very few of them ever come up. But there's one in particular that they're trying to think in terms of politics. Think in terms of politics. Always remember, we're dealing with governments here. It's not about us. It's not about us mere mortals. It's about those guys up there and what the hell they're doing. So what do you think that means when the court won't hear the case because it's inherently beyond their power to what?
enforce it?
Good, enforce it. There's nothing they can do. Hey, president, do this. Drop that. What are you going to do? I have an army. What do you have? Nothing. Go away. Are they going to hear that case? No, because they're basically impossible for them to enforce it. Let's say they were to say to, and they do this at other levels too, but let's say they issued an injunction for 900 years. I mean, do you think they should have heard that case in the first place? No, because they can't keep jurisdiction for 900 years. And they do things like that from time to time. So there actually are some limitations on the power of the court, particularly when they're dealing with other branches of the government. They're both constitutional and they're both practical. Yeah? So we hear this a little bit more lately. Right? I mean, things along the lines of, well, what if the court did rule this way? Would the executive do it anyway? And the question becomes, you know, it's not just, the thing about the army, yeah, they don't have an army. But I mean, is it the type of thing where Congress can't enforce it. It's the type of thing where a state couldn't enforce it. I mean, there's really no way to enforce it. They just wouldn't hear it. What's the point? It would just be what then? If you think about it,
Judicial opinion.
just be an
Or
advisory opinion, and they can't do that. Whatever they say must have an effect on underlying rights, otherwise they cannot hear the case. It's a jurisdictional limit. Got it? I mean, they just can't hear it. All right. A couple of other interesting ones here, which actually, one of these was on the bar a couple of years ago, and basically everybody that was taking it fell off their chair, except my students. All knew who it was. Nobody ever talks about these because nobody ever talks about them. You never hear about them. They happen all the time, but we never hear about them. Another one is called adequate and independent state grounds. What do you think that means? Well, let me give you a hint on that one. Can a state court hear an issue that arises under the Constitution? The answer is yes, they can. State Supreme Courts can actually hear
Or state Supreme Court.
issues that arise under the Constitution, and they can make decisions for themselves about what they think the Constitution says. Got it?
Yes.
So in other words, the states can actually issue a ruling on what they think the Constitution says. Not just theirs, but the federal Constitution. They're allowed to do that. So let's say that you've got a case that's, let's say it's in the California Supreme Court, and California, in their wonderful way, which they love to do, by the way, is interpreting the federal Constitution, like what they think should happen. They can do this, right? Now, right in the middle of this case, you see, you're the litigant that sees it's going south. You're going, this isn't going my way. I think I'm gonna try to pull a fast one, so what do? I appeal to the Supreme Court. You can appeal to the Supreme Court anytime you want. You get a parking ticket, you can appeal to the Supreme Court. I don't know if they're gonna hear it, but you can do it. So, what do you think the court's gonna do? Are they just gonna say, oh, well, let's see, this has been a 9-month trial, and it's going to the jury tomorrow, but obviously one side knows that they're going to lose, so they're trying to kick it up to the federal level so that we have to start all over again. What do you think they should do? They should do what? What's the word I'm looking for? Well, what would you do if you were the Supreme Court? I would. I want to go golfing today, so what am I going to do?
Just deny the appeal.
Send it back to the lower.
No, I'm not even going to do that. I'm going to basically abstain from hearing the case. I'm not saying I'm not going to hear it, but I'm going to wait till what? I want to see what the state court says.
Oh, okay.
And if I find that that's adequate and independent state grounds, like we agree, guess what? I never have to hear it. And so that's how those two work together. It's the doctrine of abstention and the doctrine of adequate and independent state grounds, which means that if the court's case is going through state courts, the court can literally just say, we want to wait and see. And then if they don't like the decision, they'll take it. They can do that. That was on the bar not too long. So make sure you know, how many more years have you got to, something like that?
Yeah.
So just make sure in 2 years you remember that, okay? Really. Or just ask me again in 2 years. What was that? You said I should really.
Do you know at the top of your head, how many cases the Supreme Court, California has in its pocket?
In California?
Yeah.
Not that many. I mean, there's under 100. There's not more than that. I mean, if I had to take a guess, I'd probably say between 10 and 20 at most, maybe less. But there's not that many because these cases take a long time.
Yeah.
Yes? No? Maybe? Yes? All right. Most of my Supreme Court classes are yelling at me by now. Okay, this is a great class. Excellent. All right, moving forward. Okay, so everyone got that, right? Okay. Now, there also, another thing you have to know, and it's actually good for points on the bar, if you have a specific situation. about the 11th Amendment limits on federal courts. Federal courts, as a practical matter, cannot hear private litigants fight with the state. They can't. And the reason for that being is what? The 11th Amendment says essentially prohibits federal courts from hearing a private party or foreign government claim against a state government. Why do you suppose that is so? Although there are ways around it now. You can sue the governor, you can sue an official, you can sue a municipality, by the way. You can sue a city, but not the state. You can sue a county, you know, the Supreme Court, but not a state. But you can't sue the state. Why do you suppose that is? Individual or a foreign government wants to sue a state, and you can't sue the federal court. Why do you suppose that is?
Is that what, because it goes back to the origins of where you couldn't sue the king?
No, not really, but what do you think? Origins of the king. Actually, it's kind of funny. It could be in a very roundabout way. Interesting. But what do you think about that?
So just to limit the amount of litigants that can, is it just to limit the amount of litigants that can sue the state?
Well, if you have a problem with the state, I mean, don't you think, what would you rather do? Would you rather sue the state in state court, or would you rather sue the state in federal court? Which would you rather do? Let's say that the state owed you money. Who do you want to have hear the claim? The state court, or do you want to have the federal government hear it? Well, the federal government. Problem is that's not what they're there to do, because you're in what? And this is where your thing came in, because they're a sovereign as well. And so you'd have one sovereign telling another sovereign what to do with a individual state. Okay, we don't allow that. But with that said, you can sue Gavin Newsom if you feel like it. You can sue, you can sue individuals, and you can sue municipalities. In other words, you can sue anything but the state. You can sue Riverside County. You can sue Riverside and India. Sue India. Cities are not part of the state, although they derive their power from the state. So again, if you see a very specific fact pattern where an individual is suing a state in federal court, you write down 11th Amendment, and then you say, even though they're there, I don't care, I have to answer the rest of the question anyway. Got it? You don't just stop and say, well, 11th Amendment, I'm done at line 3. You just failed. But bring it up. Just say there may be an 11th Amendment problem here. You actually get a couple points for that. Plus, how impressive do you think that is to the reader? Whoa, who knows the 11th Amendment? Yeah, that's not even in the first 10. Wow, this guy's hot. He's en fuego. Woo-hoo. And that's what we want to do, right? Your whole lives from here on in, you do not need to impress me. Complete waste of time. But that bar grader, you better get on their good side real fast. Otherwise, that's going to be a problem. Now, another problem we also have that actually is not considered part of justiciability. Justiciability really has to do with the cases and controversies, but we always learn these together. And some people do mix it up. I don't know why. I don't think it's appropriate, but again, it doesn't really matter. There are other persons much wiser than I am that say what I'm telling you right now is not necessarily untrue, but it's not necessarily true. Again, you get used to this after a while. In con law, it's just the way a lot of things are. Okay, but do it my way because it's easier. It makes it easy to remember, makes it way more straightforward, and the reader will love you. What's the problem? They would rather have you break these two apart. Okay. The second one is standing. Now, what does standing mean? So once the court figures out that they can hear it, they've still got one more requirement before they can actually really start business. And what would that be? It's called standing. So what does that mean? You've seen standing before, right? In civil procedure, have you not?
Mm-hmm.
There are some, standing requirements. What does that mean?
Basically, that they have the right to bring the case to them.
They are the proper litigants in this case, particularly with the plaintiff, of course. That in fact, this is the person that has been injured. This is the person that the court can redress, and the injury was caused by the government. So it's really a three-part analysis. It's not really much more complex than that. Please don't make it more complex.
Can you say that again, Jim?
Well, really, in a very realistic way, when you talk about standing, individual standing, you have three requirements. One is that it's called the injury in fact. In other words, this is the person that suffered the injury. Therefore, if we hear the case, it will solve this person's problem. Okay. Number two is that the court is able to redress what they want. In other words, yes, this court can actually fashion a remedy for you. And of course, the harm at the constitutional level has to be that it was caused by a governmental entity, or at least its representative. Right? Otherwise, they can't hear it. You're not the right. I mean, you may have a case in a controversy, but you are not the right litigant for this. You're not the right plaintiff. So that's another requirement. And then there's also organizational standing too. From time to time, we allow organizations to have standing because they represent you solve the problem of the organization, that's what they do, solves the problem of the litigant, it's caused by the government, they can fashion a remedy. So we let organizations have standing, and we also sometimes let third parties have standing when it's not appropriate to have the actual litigant stand in the place, and that's mostly minors. Okay, minors are not required, or even, they could, I guess, on some level, but they're not, they don't even have contractual. We allow their parents to represent them from time. Sometimes you even have the state represent them in the Supreme Court. That's called, strangely, in loco parentis, is actually the Latin term for it, which I always think, this is your crazy parent.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like.
The state's my crazy parent, Daddy Gavin, okay? I can go for that. Nice guy, I met him not too long ago. Very cool, I like him. I don't care what anyone says. Good job. Okay, so here you have, I gave you some more rules over this couple pages. Okay, these look perfectly good. Okay, and then what we'll do here, yeah, this will be fun. Let's just go ahead and, who's got Lujan? That's actually a pretty big case. Lujan, who has their briefs from last week?
That's me.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I'll do it.
Yeah, and it is pronounced Lujan. I don't always know, but if I don't know, I'll tell you. But when I've heard or seen something about it by professionals, and they do pronounce it Lujan, so.
Okay, so this is Lujan versus Defenders of Wildlife, and this is in 1992. And what we have here is we have two organizations who are bringing forth this claim because, let me just read it. So I have set facts. Section 7A2 of Endangered Species Act of 1973 instructs the Secretary of the Interior to promulgate by regulation a list of those species which are either endangered or threatened under the enumerated criteria, and to define the critical habit of these species. Additionally, the rule requires each federal agency to consult with the relevant secretary to ensure that any action funded by the agency is not likely to jeopardize the continued existence of habitat of any endangered or threatened species. The secretaries go on to make a regulation that states that that these organizations have to give them a list and tell them, when these funding, these projects that they're going to put up and where they're going to put them. But the regulation states, I believe at first it states foreign nations, and then they go back and they change it to say just US and the high seas. That's where the issue comes in, because the organizations that bring the claims state that's their problem. They want them to go back to the foreign nations because they feel that it's protected, that they want them to protect more. They want them to protect the whole foreign nation and just not just the US and the high seas, because they feel that, they're just basically saying if they're not going to do it here, they're going to go over there and do it and set up these camps. And there's still animals over there that we want to see and that we want to go and see part in viewing.
So maybe someday we might go back to this country
Yes.
and see some more animals.
And
that's
so-
the basis of their claim of their loss.
Yes, that one day we might go, which is where we come into the issue here, because the Lujan They go to the district court, the respondents, organizations want them to, they request that the district court have the Secretary of State redo this regulation and issue a new one, making it go back, like I said, to the foreign nations. The district court actually rules in favor of them, saying that they gave them summary judgment on the merits. Even after the Secretary of State did ask for summary judgment as well, they denied his and said they had summary judgment on the merits. Basing it off of, they said they did have standing. The appeals court, the one does appeal this, and they take it up to the appeals court, who does affirm the district court's decision. The Supreme Court then decides, they say no. The issue here was, did they have standing to bring this to the Supreme Court, or did they even have it? And they even asked for review of this regulation, which was what I saw. Did they have standing to ask for review of the regulation? The Supreme Court said no, they didn't have standing, because based on, just like what you said a couple minutes ago, based on the elements of injury, redressability, and causation, all of them basically, they did not stand. When they looked at injury, they looked at two of the affidavits that were given to them or provided to the court by two of the respondents, and like you said, they showed no injury, no imminent injury, no actual injury. It was just, oh, one day I went over here and I didn't even see them, but I might want to return and see them. And then they also said that they weren't, their claim was against the organizations, not the actual secretary. They were stating that these organizations were going to go and do these, put these projects up, and that they would cause them, not the secretary. The secretary was just making the regulation. And so the court said they couldn't redress the problem because they couldn't redress the actual organizations. They could only address the secretary here because that's who the claim was against. So here, they also addressed the issue where the Court of Appeals said that they had procedural injury because of the so-called citizen suit provision of the ESA that provided them basically saying that anybody who felt that they were being affected by this regulation could come and say, no, well, I'm one day plan to go over there. I want to make sure that I can go. And the Supreme Court said that was not correct, again, because of what you said, that they weren't there to really enforce the laws, and they couldn't just allow anybody to come and try to make them enforce laws, because that was actually somebody else's power within the three branches of government. So that's kind of my view on this.
That's not bad, not bad.
I don't like to read from these, I'm sorry.
Well, it's very technical. I mean, it's funny that they throw this case at you as law students, because it's very technical. But at the same time, it really does kind of show you something that's sometimes it teaches you the rule in law that nothing's absolute. And so sometimes you can, in some bizarre way, show you have some kind of injury, right? You can show you have some kind of causation, and you can show you have some kind of redressability, but it's just too attenuated. It's just too de minimis. And so even though you can even kind of show those, it's just, you can't, because then it becomes illogical. Then how can anyone not have an injury, right?
Mm-hmm.
So just to give you a short version of this case, so what's happening is you have two persons who are looking at the endangered. They come from an organization, right, dedicated to animal protection, and they're looking at the Endangered Species Act, which has a part of it that says not only are we going to protect animals in the United States, but we're going to protect them overseas too, in foreign territories, right? That all seems very reasonable. And so one of the requirements, though, before they would give the okay to any company to build something in foreign with, American money or whatever, American money or with American companies, is that the Secretary of the Interior, I think it was, has to look at it. They have to look at the plan. Okay, so that department has to look at the plan. They don't have to say anything about it. They just have to look at it. And that's what it says. Okay, it just says they have to look at it. They can say something, they can not say something. Whatever they say has no effect on anything, quite frankly, but they have to look at it. Well, one day somebody figured out that was really stupid. And so they said, yeah, you don't have to look at it anymore. Well, these two go berserk because now they say all the crocodiles or whatever the hell they wanted to see, whatever going, are gonna die because, you never know.
May die.
May die.
May.
We might go back someday and they may die because the Secretary of the Interior didn't look at this report about endangered species on foreign soil. Okay, does it sound like they have an injury? Not really. Does it sound like there's something the court can do about it? They could put the secretary back in, I guess, if they could force him to do that, because it's again, becomes kind of a political issue. He's not under, the court. And is it caused by the government? Kind of, it is a government entity, I guess, but other than that. And so they're basically telling you that even though technically,
It's all
maybe.
hypothetical kind of thing.
Yeah, but this is just too far attenuated. So this is your line in the sand. Now, with that said, let me just give you Massachusetts so we can go to our break. So that sounds pretty low, right? Anyways, so when they were arguing in Massachusetts case about the EPA, it's all about EPA and methane regulations and stuff like that. Massachusetts brings a suit saying, hey, if you let too many of these greenhouse gases, these carbons and carbon monoxide, I think they're talking about, right, into the atmosphere over a fairly long period of time, because the sea levels will rise, part of our coastline in the inches over a very long period of time will erode and disappear at an unnatural rate, because remember, they're going to anyways, but they're going to speed up the rate of erosion of our coast, right, if you don't regulate this, right? And so naturally, the people on the other side say, so what? Where's your injury? Where's your harm? You're going to lose whatever. You see what I'm saying? It's very de minimis. What the courts say? Sounds good to us. They're good to go. Massachusetts had standing. What's the rule in this class? What's the rule? What's the law? Whatever the Supreme Court says it is. Go have a good break.
Yeah.
See ya.
Very true.
You tell me. Come back at 1:45, please. We're going to try to make 8:30 for this class, the ending period. Something around there so that it will go home. I still maintain my general likability. Much love to students. Okay, so far so good?
Yes.
All right.
I might miss this part.
Yeah, I've never had a fist fight break out over
No, not
standing yet. That's the
when I first
What do you mean?
Please even him standing. Thank you, you're so smart. No, when I didn't have to, even though that the
Yeah.
injury had to be traced to the government.
I follow this artist who makes like superheroes and that's restaurants.
Yeah. You might be dyslexic. I don't like to, I can't read and speak.
Oh.
I have to just speak. If I try to read and speak, then I fucking sound like that.
That was Junior.
Is that an artist?
Yeah, he's an artist. That's the first issue. Like, remember?
Ah, you like that kind of art?
Yeah, it's very.
Ah.
Yeah. It's like, ooh, this isn't appropriate for kids anymore. There's a really good one for fast food. Okay. I know, yeah, that's Wendy's. Of course. We could go like this girl like oops saying that. See?
Oh, there you
Wendy's
go.
Express.
Yeah, you would like something like that.
Oh, I love that. I wish I could make her this.
Yours porn cartoon.
It's just I started. Oh, she's working you for me. No, I don't like that kind of stuff. Why you told me this?
kind of school
During
is
the
this?
debate, I guess they put in, watch this. They just released this ad on AOC.
This is the base of socialism and ignorance. Does Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez know the horror of socialism? My father was minutes from death in Cambodia before a forced marriage saved his life. That's socialism. Forced obedience, starvation. Mine is a face of freedom. My skin is not white and not outrageous, racist, or socialist. I'm a Republican. This is the face of socialism.
Highly diluted. And probably well paid for that. Yeah, well, you know what, I'm telling you, I've said it before and I'll say it again, I feel very confident that within 5 years, AOC will be considered sort of center of the party. Wait and see. That's where we're going, whether this man likes it or not. That's where America is going. It's going toward AOC. You can see it. It's not. That's the way it's going to go. We're going to become more like other nations in the world, just like we've always done. You know, we take the good and we take the bad, but that's what's going to happen. I mean, it sounds kind of funny, but and again, it doesn't really matter. But it would be nice if Bernie Sanders stepped in, just let the younger persons do this, because once that happens, the next generation comes up. That's what's going to happen. They're not going to go through this. Like, why would you want to grow up having no job, no future, live home till you're 94? I mean, it's ridiculous. Nobody in their right mind is going to grow up into this. So, you know, unfortunately, better or worse. Although I tried, don't blame me. But, you know, the baby boomers kind of ruined it. As they grew older, they just decided they didn't want to share the wealth. And they sucked you guys with the bill. So, you know, the baby boomers are going to be, I'm like one of the last baby boomers. My generation there's only 2 years after me. It goes to 1960. So we're the past, you know, you guys are the future. And if you continue this nonsense, on you, but I know they would. You guys won't. Because no generation does this. It's just sad because we could have done without Trump. Because all he really does is just set it back. That's all he did. He's not going to win. We're not going to become a xenophobic national country. It's just not going to happen. There's too many people who don't want that to happen. And we're not Germany. We're not small. We don't have blood. There's none of these things here. We think these people are idiots. Everything I told you about because we're Americans. Yeah. But you still got the bill, and that I can't. I don't know what Trump's going to do. You know, he's just blowing up the deficit. He's blowing up the budget. These are good things. It'll take a lot to overcome. You know, we'll be very lucky if we get out of this one. So we will, you know, because there are ways out of it. Thank heavens. But it's too bad because you could have had an oil-free world 5, 10 years. You could have had, you know, all sorts of advantages. Could have a green environment, you know, green technologies. You know, if we don't do it, we're going to get killed. That's why they don't want you to know that. That's partly why China will never make a deal with us. They're so far ahead of us in green technologies and things like that. And they're catching us in informational technologies that the more that we fool around, they don't care. You know, Ping is president for life. He doesn't care. Trump thinks he's going to be president for life. He's not. Terrible idea. Anybody hear anything about the debate? Anyone do good? Anyone do bad? Anyone do indifferent? I probably won't watch it tonight, so if there's anything interesting, let me know.
Yeah, that was just the first thing that popped up on Twitter because AOC had replied something to it.
I like her. She reminds me of a young Ginsburg.
Oh, yeah. I know. The first thing that pops up on my feed is always a cat video. But that's my generation. We still like that stuff.
Jorge Ramos got kicked out You know who, Jorge Ramos?
Really? Why?
And it says moderator Jorge Ramos kicked off the damn debate by sharing a message in Spanish for the Latino audience. After speaking briefly in Spanish, he said he told Latinos, despite the fact that we are experiencing difficult times, this is our country too. They got kicked out.
Okay. So the resistance grows. How bad. See, I got to watch like the first half hour, then I had to take off. The only thing I saw was Elizabeth Warren looked really good. She came out smoking. Bernie's, he's done. He's too old. He's not gonna. I mean, it's sad. It's not that his ideas are that bad, but he's hoarse and he looks really bad. And this really plays.
He looks beat
And so
down.
nobody's gonna believe he can really do this or be president. So that's actually really bad. It's sad, but that's how people think. So he didn't look too good. And then they were basically ignoring everyone else. Hard to say.
Well, there's a few up there that you're okay to ignore.
Yeah.
It's like,
What are they gonna do about it? They're gone anyway. I like Beto still. I wish he would hang around. Oh well.
really?
Well, he could theoretically be the candidate that could win California and Texas. If any candidate can do that, Republican or Democrat, they basically shut everyone else out. It's really hard to beat anyone that would do that, but it's almost impossible to beat a Democrat that does that because they get New York too. So if you're a Republican and you do that, you theoretically could still get caught at the wire. But if
Yeah.
you're a Democrat and you do that, it would be a miracle for a Republican. But it just isn't going to happen. It's just not enough votes out there that are even. You couldn't even do it with a changing voting machine. No one would believe it. You just don't have that audience anymore. So that's why I always liked him. I thought, God, here's the guy, that could probably win both. But I think he's too young right now, and he makes a lot of kind of things that make you kind of go,
I was
One
gonna
like
say,
him
that's
is
why I'm like, really? Because that's how I feel about him. Like, I don't, like, for some reason, but I don't know why. Because obviously, he's done good and he's tried his hardest.
he has a good message.
Yeah,
But
but
he's just, I don't know. Do you really want him with the nuclear codes?
you just like, it's like when those were like, do I really trust you? I don't know. Something about him, I just.
See, I think he should run for Senate again. I think he should run against Cruz again. Cruz, he beat him this time. I think that would be quite an accomplishment. If Ted Cruz even runs, now the rumor he's not gonna run. So
Who's this? Beto? Oh, Beto.
Beto, he could beat him this time. Yeah, he wouldn't get away with that. The only reason that Cruz won was the Republicans threw so much money at that race, it's not even funny. And they can't do that again, because if they have to throw that much money at every race, they can't sustain it. And so that's actually what's gonna put them out of business, is they're gonna be an unsustainable party because they can't raise enough money. That's what's going to happen. You heard it here first. It's happened before. It'll happen again. But that's what's happening to the Republican Party. So. And that's when they disappear. Yep.
I just wonder how long it's gonna take for them to disappear.
Well, I mean, I know it
True
sounds funny,
question.
but it really, what next year is the rest of this year and then the first half of next year is gonna be really key. Because if they keep going down this road, oh boy, it's gonna be really ugly, because you can kind of see, well, Trump's not going to win, and I'll tell you why. Okay, there's actually two reasons. Both of them are very technical. And yes, I did say that last time, if you ever do ask some of the other students. But I forgot about one thing, which was really, which I don't think anyone else is going to forget. Forgot about how pervasive and persuasive racism in America really is. And I shouldn't
You
have
must
done,
have.
I shouldn't have done that, because I used to live in the South. And, you know, these things that we hear here, they're nothing. They are nothing compared to what goes on down there. They are insane. They're crazy. They're crazy, period. End of story. Not insulting anybody in particular. I'm just saying the things they believe and the way that they put religion and government together are just insanity. I mean, I've had people come up to me and say, in all honesty, right?
Ask me to deliver that?
Yeah, in all honesty, I mean, they're being very blunt with me, that democracy is the work of the devil.
What is that?
I used to live in the South,
Oh.
and I'm sitting there going, it is? Why?
Were you?
And they don't really know why. It's because somebody in the Sunday church told them to. And so these are people that are used to following. They don't understand the theory of having free will. Free will is not good to these people. You need to follow God's will. Who's going to tell you God's will? Me. And it's the whole power structure. See, this is where these mega churches and these mega people come from.
Well, I'm the devil to my parents because I don't believe anymore. I was younger, but I'm the devil to them. Not like in that sense, but they're always like trying to throw God at me when they talk to me, and I'm like, yeah, well, where is it? This sacrifice because we're just not now. I haven't seen you in months. So
So true, so true.
but I get a lot of that too.
Yeah. Some of my friends get a lot of that. I mean, my family forget it, but you know, my family has a weird. I was actually an Orthodox Jew till I was 6. I was actually brought up in that, and then my grandmother died. And then once my grandmother died, my parents started eating pork chops, and it was all downhill from there.
Oh no.
We gave up all the stuff.
We laugh.
Yeah, the taste of the pork
Oh, I
chops.
still remember the day they
You serious?
I didn't
Like
know
you
what it
remember
was.
the day?
I was like 6 years old, and I remember looking into a pan and saying, "What's that?" Because I knew what a lamb chop looked like,
Mhm.
but I didn't know what a pork chop looked like, and this was a lot thicker and a lot bigger. And I said, "What's that?" And it smelled really funny to me because I never, except maybe in a restaurant, never smelled pork before. And they said, "Well, that's a pork chop," and I was like, and I was like, "Oh my God, my cancer's possessed." And I just thought that was the worst thing ever.
Press to share.
They had to actually calm me down and all this stuff, but what can I say?
Oh.
And then they sort of explained it to me. Now that grandma's gone. You know, when you're a Jew, you can be Orthodox, but you can also be conservative. And there's even one below that called Reform. Well, that's what we're going to do. And we changed temples and the whole thing. And I was totally down for it at that point, though. See,
It's all pork chops. Bring it on.
oh, this was great.
I'll bring
because
any on.
No, now I didn't have to go to Hebrew school 3 days a week. I had to go
Oh
one day.
wow, of course.
I'm totally down with this. So that's cool. Just Sundays. I didn't have to go Tuesdays and Thursdays anymore. I used to speak fluent Hebrew when I was young. Believe it or not. Now I can remember 6 words. I haven't used it in so long, but yep, I actually could speak pretty much close to fluent Hebrew. I could certainly understand you if you were talking it. Yeah, that's it.
Hey,
Yeah.
well, my parents are Pentecostal.
Pentecostal.
So just as bad.
Sorry to hear that.
Couldn't
I'm so
wear
sorry to hear
pants.
that.
Couldn't.
The only thing I can say about the Pentecostals that I've met is they're not as bad as the Charismatics. That's about it. They're nuts. I mean, they're just off the crazy.
The what?
Charismatics.
Never heard of that.
You see a lot of those down in South America. They're just.
My daughters will look at me like that when I've gone back home to El Paso and we've gone to church with my parents and they're hearing preacher, pastor, whatever they have now, and he's like, they're like, Mom, what the hell? Because they're like, if you do this, you're a sinner. Sorry, I don't know if anybody follows religion. I'm sorry, I'll take that back. But they were like, free speech. Yeah, no, my daughters are like, what? Which they're actually having institutional conversations in their classes. In my daughter's journalism class, they actually spoke about everything that was going on.
That's promising.
They're actually gonna do an article on it in the Sphere at the Palm Desert High.
No
They're gonna try to do an article on it,
Nice.
which is weird because it's very rich people. So,
Well, it's Palm Desert.
Yeah.
What else do you need to know?
exactly.
That's cool.
So, yeah, that's pretty, I actually have some friends there. Yeah, some of the things they say are just unbelievable. So,
Yes.
yeah.
You have to have
I
like.
actually did talk to Janet Byrne once.
Oh, really?
Once.
What? That one time you.
That was plenty. Yeah, I didn't care for her. But she's very loud. and
Did she win
obnoxious,
again?
by the way.
Did she win again?
Well, she won for city council,
Yeah.
but she lost for supervisor.
Oh.
Yeah, she ran against Manny Perez, and she
Oh.
ran this insane, racist, crazy campaign, and everyone was complaining. I ran into her at Las Casuelas Nuevas. I ran into her there. She was eating dinner, and I recognized her. And it was right before the election, and she said, "Oh, I hope you're voting for me," and da 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 da. And we have to stick together, and you know. And I'm looking at her like, "You know who I am at all?" I'm not as you would necessarily, but you know, I am friends with your husband too.
Yeah.
He could tell you that everything you're saying right now is you shouldn't be saying that to me.
Shouldn't do.
So
What do you believe?
your call. But you know, if you're me.
Very blunt she is.
Anyway, we will resist. Carry on. Okay. Anyways, this any other questions then about? In my opinion, that's what we'll do for this chapter. So we're all done with one. All right. Just so we're clear in this class, although it could change in the future, I don't know. But we're going to shoot to be out by 8:30. Okay, just remember that seems to be fair enough. And again, wherever we're at doesn't matter to me because we'll just pick up wherever we left off. So just remember to always, what I recommend in this class is to keep a binder
Yeah.
of your handouts because a lot of times we stop in the middle. It's not unusual at all. So anyway, all right. Okay, so totally confused yet? Don't worry, I've got plenty of weeks left. Don't worry about it. I'll get there sooner or later. The one thing you should not let me get away with, although you might have to at some point, Stephen, but don't let me say, well, that's just the way it is. Okay, there's no such thing. But there is. The law is whatever.
The law says
so, and that's true. So what's the rule in this class?
No, it's whatever the Supreme Court says.
Wait, there's two rules we have so far. Number one.
Get out of
What's-
8:30.
What?
Oh.
Let's throw that in. One, get out at 8:30. And keep that one. Number two, there's only one question in common law. What is it?
Can the government do that?
Can the government do that? But there are no other questions. Did you even notice through our reading today? Can the government do that? That's the only question we ask over and over and over. Right? That's what justice is the ability about. Can they hear the case? And that's what standing is about. Is this the proper litigants that the court can hear the case? Can Massachusetts do that? Can the EPA do that? That's all we asked, right? There hasn't been a second question. Can Marbury do that? Can Madison do that? Same. All revolves around that. So if we always start there, we're always at a pretty good start. Because it always focuses on that, again, this is not for us, except for the Bill of Rights, this is not for us, mere mortals. This is how the government runs, not us. And it affects us, like, if you all right, so moving forward, some interesting kind of information to let you know real quick about the federal government. We do have as we discussed a little bit earlier, we are a country essentially of two sovereigns. Correct? We have the federal government and we have the states. Each one is a sovereign in and of itself, right? Again, a good definition of a sovereign is somebody or a group of people who inhabit a certain area and agree to live by a certain set of rules. That's actually not a bad definition for a sovereign for our purposes. So you can see how the federal government is a sovereign, and you can see how the states are sovereign as well. Right? So, okay, so with that in mind, what happens is when you look back at the history of the United States, here we have a situation, and we'll talk more about it another time. But the United States, the colonists declared independence in 1776, right? In 1781, so a 5-year gap, they finally draw a document about how they're going to interact with 13 colonies within themselves. Because, again, they've got to bring them together mostly for purposes of defense. And they also have to start to learn how to trade as well, things of that nature, right? Particularly how to deal with foreign entities as one. You can't deal with 13 different entities because they just split you up. So these are big problems, right? And so they drafted a document called the Articles of Confederation. Right? And basically, if you look at that, well, for one thing, there's nothing about courts in it. There's no court system. The president is kind of a figurehead, and all the power is actually just concentrated in Congress. So the most powerful person in the United States was actually the Speaker of the House by far. By far, was the most powerful person under that document. The problem with that was, many told that the biggest problem of all is that even though the Speaker of the House had all this power, there was no power to actually give the Speaker of the House. So again, there was no ability of the federal government to actually get the states to do anything. So this crumbles, right? Finally, in 1786, the war was not won in 1 year. The Revolutionary War actually lasted about 8 years, after which we finally had a treaty with the British called the Treaty of Paris, and off we went. Okay, that's right. And so we go forward, and we're not doing too well, right? I mean, to be honest with you, the states were constantly jabbing at each other. They weren't getting along. Nobody knew what was going on. And so they got together and they tried to, again, constitute some kind of a federal government that would oversee the states. And so, they go to Continental Congress, right? You know about that, Independence Hall, Philadelphia, fill in all the blanks. And they actually come up with the Constitution in 1787 is actually they announce to the world that they have a document. That's actually an interesting story, but that's the day that we actually count as the drafting of the Constitution. It's an interesting story. But anyway, we'll get into that someday. But so now we have a constitution, which basically makes us a democratic republic. We have it. So, and initially nobody would sign it. Well, because it didn't have the Bill of Rights. That was actually not added until 1790. Added and ratified until 1791. When afterwards the founding fathers finally realized that when you showed it to the average person, they said, "What? What's in it for us?" I mean, take that off and you read the rest of it. There'd be like an owner's manual or something. You couldn't possibly understand why this is in your best interest. Or the average person couldn't. Why is this good? And the price, and it's like, I like that word, free speech. Yeah. All of a sudden, now we're rolling. If you ever want to know what the Constitution does say, by the way, there is a book called the Federalist Papers, which was a series of articles that came out. It's basically written mostly by Alexander Hamilton. Some of them are written by James Madison, and the ones about foreign affairs is written by John Jay. So again, really big, heavyweights trying to explain why people should sign the Constitution. And these are actually articles that came out in different newspapers. So it was only collected later. So when you read it together, it's kind of hard to understand. And also some of it is almost unintelligible because they're talking about local events that we don't even know what they're talking about in some of it. See, that's one time I would have to say to you, I don't know. Nobody knows. And they're referring to things you think, what the hell, who's that? What's that? We just don't know. But some of it's very illuminatory at the same time. It's very interesting about how the founding fathers really did see how the Constitution, and in particular, how the Bill of Rights worked. And very interesting. So, people always say, what did the founding fathers think? Well, those three wrote about it, I can tell you that, you can go look at that. Washington kept a daily diary, wrote about everything. Most of what we know about that period comes out of his diaries, actually. Those are the best source for information about colonial America, probably to this day. Anyways, with that said, so this idea that we don't know what they said, this is not super true. We'll get to that someday. All right, so here we go. And what they're trying to do is now they're trying to form this union, essentially between three people, the federal government, the states, and the people. Okay, there's three persons involved, not just two, right? Because the Constitution is for us as well. And they put it together, and what they decide in a short version is you have the federal government, which you have the president who really doesn't have any powers, very few that are actually spoken of in the Constitution. If you read it, it kind of says he has a domestic power, kind of has a foreign power, and then he does a lot of things like hire people and pardon them, and these like really lesser powers. These are, you might even call them obligations to some degree, but just to help him facilitate whatever power. They don't really tell you what it is. And they did that on purpose. Again, we'll talk more about that later. The states, of course, were meant to maintain their powers, right? And so what they did was they put in the 10th Amendment, which says, by the way, all the powers not ceded to the federal government remain with the states. And so we call that the police power. If you ever hear me say that, it just means 10th Amendment. They're pretty much interchangeable for the most part. The police power basically consists of the power to take care of their citizenry, health, safety, welfare. Those are the three big topics, yeah. So health, safety, and welfare, that's why the state does those things. So, okay, what's left? Well, we need somebody that makes laws. And so Congress is going to be the federal that does that. Now remember that the federal laws are going to be the laws that everybody has to adhere to, because everybody has to adhere to the Constitution as well. It's going to be the highest law in the land. So you're kind of getting a pecking order there. You see what I'm saying? Everyone does something different. Yeah. And then we're at the bottom, but we're also at the top too. It's, if you really think about it, it's a really weird system they came up with. But again, we're talking about government, so it's not about mere mortals and human beings. It's about governmental stuff. So we have to always keep that on. So the question then becomes, okay, what do we need the federal government to do? What do we need Congress to do? What laws what do we need them to do? You know, all the states are asking that, all the people are asking that. And so one of the things that's really interesting is they decided that, unlike the president, that the powers of Congress would have to be enumerated. Now, what that means as a practical matter is that it has to have a number before it, and it has to appear in black letter law, right? Otherwise, it can't be a power. In other words, these are the powers that Congress has. They're called enumerated powers. Again, remember, the president really does not have enumerated powers. It's a very interesting system we have. And then the courts are just a little bit off to the side for us right now. We sort of went through that earlier. And so the two powers that were essentially given to Congress, there's only two. They only really have two what we call emanating powers. In other words, if this is their two tasks they have the powers to do. If it's not this, they can't do it. Got it? Because they're enumerated powers. Okay. One, they have what's called the Commerce Clause, right? You've all heard of that, the Commerce Clause. And what that means is that they are the persons that are required to regulate commerce among the states. And if you read it, I think it says the tribes as well, and foreign as well. So there's something to it. Right? So they have what's called the Commerce Clause. We'll get into that in a minute. The other power they have is the power to, it's called the tax and spend power, or whatever else you want to call it. That's what I call it. And so they have this power called the tax and spend. In other words, they can tax people and spend it for the public, generally for the general welfare is what we believe, okay? You have to sort of tie in the preamble into that. But generally, you know, whatever they do, they have to be able to fund it, and they have to be able to tax people, and they have to be able to, right, spend it. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to do anything. So it's interesting because you add a third power onto that, which is not an originating or emanating power. But of course, they can make laws that are necessary and proper to actually facilitate those goals. I mean, they have to be able to do that, otherwise the two powers are useless. So let me ask you a question. You now know the power of Congress, right? To make laws. They can do commerce among the state, and they can tax and spend, and they can make laws in pursuit of those two goals. So how did they do all this? How did they do all this? Look, well, look where they are. Where is Congress not? Do they regulate laws within states? Yes, they do, all the time, all the time, all the time. They regulate laws about guns in schools.
Oh, yeah.
What's that got to do with commerce? What's that got to do with tax and spend? Do they have, are they talking about laws right now that are giving women who are,
Okay.
you know, subject to violence as, all they're trying to do, by the way, is give them a civil remedy. They're not trying to take away all their rights, the criminal stuff's still there. But they're trying to give them a civil remedy at federal court, just in case the state won't do it. Makes a lot of sense, actually, if you think about it. Of course, the Republicans don't think so because it's much more cruel to actually make people suffer more. And so they think we live our lives to suffer, so therefore, that's another story for another time. Anyways, how do they do that? What does that got to do with commerce? What's that got to do with tax and spend? Wait a couple weeks, you'll find out. I'm going to tell you how all this happened. But that is kind of amazing, isn't it? They only have two powers. So whenever we talk about Congress in this class, you have to tell me, is that the Commerce Clause? Or you have to tell me, is that the Tax and Spend Clause? There aren't any other powers. Never say it's the Necessary and Proper Clause. It's not true. That's not an originating power. Those are only in service of the other two. I guarantee you Congress has two powers only, period. And they make laws to those pursuits, that's it. They don't have any other power. None, zero, zip, zilch. It has to be enumerated. Those are the only two that appear in the Constitution, period. Okay, everyone got that? I know it's a hard concept to understand at first because it seems insanity. Maybe it is, but it's what we got, right? So we'll see how that worked out. All right, but we'll talk more about that later, because for now, we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna look at an early case. Again, this is McCullough versus Maryland, 1919, quite early. When you see these really early cases and you see things like wheat or something like that in the name, that's actually the person that wrote down the decision for the Supreme Court, the person who reported it. They actually carried around their decisions in a book and they just wrote them by hand. And this guy's name was Wheat. He was the guy that was doing this case for that year. And so it's kind of interesting. You can see pictures of, they still have the books, most of them. And so you can see the pictures of them. And they're just these, they're kind of thin actually, but they're kind of big. It's like writing in big ledgers. And this was, and you're looking at the books, it's about this wide. And it's like, this was the Supreme Court for about 10 years or something. It's, you know, how many books do we have in our library? You know, I mean, and you're looking at these books and each one has a name and that's how you knew it. You went to the person who actually recorded it. So there you go, early citation system, you know. Well, you know, the original patent office was done on index cards. So what does that tell you? You know, you actually applied for a patent and they kind of went, yeah, that's good. And they put it, it was like a Dewey Decimal System, like going to a library. It was all on paper. Of course, it all burned down in the War of 1812. So they started over. Amazing stories in American history, I'm telling you. They didn't even become modern until 1836 when they finally figured out a sort of modern way to track these things. So it depends who you ask. The first patent was actually issued in 1897, I think it is, or the first patent was issued in 1936, depending on who you ask. Strange but true. There you go. Anyways, with that said, so we have an early case here, which kind of tells you about the other power, right? This is the tax and spend power. A very interesting case. Anyways, who can give me the story of good brief? McCullough versus Maryland.
I'll do it.
It's not a bad case, it's all about corruption.
Yeah. Okay, so here Congress passed the bill to create the Bank of the US. And it was established, a branch was established in Maryland. So in 1818, Maryland passed a law that said that they were taxing all those banks that were not chartered by the state, and they were gonna tax them $15,000 and then penalize those that didn't. So here McCulloch was a cashier of the bank, and he refused to pay the tax. So then they're suing him on behalf of the bank. So in the lower courts, in the trial in the Court of Appeals, there was judgment for Maryland. And then so it was taken to the Supreme Court on a writ of error to the Supreme Court. So there was two issues here. One, does Congress have the power to incorporate a bank? And two, whether the state of Maryland may, without violating the Constitution, tax that branch. So for my first rule, I have it on page 85. It says, let the end be legitimate, let it be within the scope of the Constitution, all means which are appropriate, which are plainly adapted to that end, which are not prohibited, but consist of the letter and spirit of the Constitution are constitutional. The second one I have is, the Constitution and the laws in pursuance thereof are supreme, and that they control the Constitution and laws of the respective states and cannot be controlled by them. So essentially, the two arguments for the first question, whether Congress has the power to incorporate a bank, Maryland was arguing that there should be a stricter interpretation of the Constitution, limiting the power of Congress to the express powers in the Constitution, whereas the court.
Well, hold on, let's stop there, not that, you're doing fine, but let me just bring out, again, this is the nature of constitutional law.
Mhm.
Does the Constitution say that the federal government can have its own bank?
No.
No. That correct? Okay, does it say that they can have a post office?
It does, actually doesn't it
Of
on
course,
section
it's
8?
called the post office clause.
Yeah.
That's why the post office is federally owned and run,
Oh,
because it's
shoot, I
actually in the
remember that.
Constitution.
Yeah.
But it doesn't say you can have a bank, and yet, early on, there was a bank. What do you think about that? Now, that's how constitutional law works. You know, again, there's very few things that when I say black letter law, do you know how few things are black letter? Do you know that the word Air Force does not appear in the Constitution? How do we have one? Well, for many, many years, it was part of the Army, actually. There was no separate branch. And then finally, in the 1940s, it came to their senses and just said, that's ridiculous. So again, there was no provision for an Air Force, although the founding fathers certainly knew about hot air balloons. You know, I think they could have theorized you could drop one from a, bomb from it or something. But anyways, this is the nature of constitutional law. And so what Maryland is saying is you don't have the right to have a federal bank because it's not enumerated. It doesn't say under the powers of Congress that Congress can set up a federal bank. It does say they can tax and spend, and it does say they can regulate commerce among the states. And then they can figure out whether this is a necessary and proper extension of that power. I mean, just when I say that, does that make sense? That if you're taxing and spending, you might want your own bank? That's why it's technically, it's constitutional, not that it says so. But it actually falls under the necessary and proper clause because it would facilitate collecting taxes and spending money. Anyways, forward, remember the date of this case, and again, remember today, we don't have a federal, there's no more federal banks, we did away with that.
So then the court said that Congress has the power of the purse and the sword, so they can regulate commerce, which is, then they went to say that they analyzed the interpretation of what necessary meant. So Maryland was arguing for a stricter interpretation of it, which that would limit the power of, obviously, of the Congress. So further, the U.S. Bank
Stop,
is in
please.
yes.
Again, you're doing fine. But again, I want to point out again how constitutional law works. What you said correctly, by the way, that they're looking essentially Very famous case, and part of the reason why is because they're looking at the words necessary and looking at the word proper. Now, do you agree there's a difference between those two? Is there a difference between necessary and proper? Sure, they're two different words, right? Would it be in extension of the power to tax and spend? Would it be proper for the federal government to have a bank? Just proper. I mean, is it in the ballpark is what that really means, right? Is this outrageous behavior? No, of course not. Let's think about this though. If you're gonna be Maryland, you're gonna challenge this though. Is it necessary? Probably not. You know, you can just do it with state banks. Just set it up with them. So it's probably not necessary. Interesting argument. But that's econ law, that's how we roll. Gotta figure out what the words mean and how they apply to this situation.
Well, here they define necessary as being needful, requisite, essential, or conducive to, so I guess it's just how you
So,
interpret the word.
What do you think about that? Is that a broad?
That's a very broad,
They make it.
yeah, very broad to expand.
So does necessary for purposes of constitutional law really mean necessary as we understand that as persons? And the answer is no. It's much, much broader than that. But remember, it's okay, because we're talking about governmental conduct, not our conduct. You see the difference? Good deal. Okay, keep going.
So based on that interpretation of what necessary meant, they said that Congress does have the power to incorporate the bank.
And they decide that with this broad interpretation of necessary, it's clearly proper, it's not a crazy suggestion. They can do this, and so they say yes. Very good, that's the first part of the case.
So the second one was whether the state can tax the US government.
Excellent. So stop right there. Dual sovereignty. We don't know. Today, does the federal government ever tax the state? Yes. Today, does the state ever tax the federal government? Yes. There are instances they can actually, if they act as a buyer in the state and don't have any particular federal reason for actually they can tax them. So it does go back and forth. There are certain immunities, things they can and cannot do to each other with taxes, but nobody knew what they were.
Okay, so here Justice Marshall said that the laws pursuant to the Constitution are superior and control the laws of the state. So that's why he said that states couldn't roll over the federal law. And he had a quote here that said, the court said the power to tax is the power to destroy.
Wasn't that true? Okay, I'm gonna put a 99% tax on you. You're going out of business, right? Can they do that? Yeah. That's the whole point of the case. You could do that, so we have to figure out where the immunities are. That's what they're trying to do. Because they don't want the state doing that with the federal government. Because they've already said they can have a bank. So how does it make sense that they can have a bank and then you can tax it out of existence? Very good. Forward.
So basically they said that the state can't tax the government because they wanted the government to be superior and they didn't want other states to have to rely on, I guess, one state taxing the government that would affect them all. And they also said that if Maryland could tax the bank, they would also be able to tax like their mail and judicial process. So, and they didn't want that. So they said that a state cannot tax the federal government, and so the lower court's decisions were reversed.
Very good. Okay. That's good. All right. So does it, very good. Does anyone have anything they want to add to that? That was so good that now I have to talk. Thought we were gonna go right page 30. So, okay, any other questions about this case? I'll just give you a short, just a short, I'll give you some more history about it and stuff, a little more grounding. And what we'll do is we'll skip the rest of this chapter, just go ahead and read it. They're just different examples of how these, mostly what the necessary proper does, and just examples of what the United States and federal government can and cannot do. And then next time we'll start up at page. Here it is. We'll start at page 113 next time. So what we'll do is we'll start up with the commerce power. So we'll be through with the taxes and the necessary property. Okay? Does that sound okay? Yeah, all right. So because that's a huge case, so let's do that one quick. Stuff like that. Anyway, so again, McCullough versus Maryland, very early, interesting case though, because it really explains a lot of the dual sovereignty, which nobody knew really how it was going to work, particularly when it came to things like taxing and spending, which is really, you know, the power to tax is the power to destroy. Very famous line out of this case. Again, you can, if you're a governmental entity and you have the power to tax, you can tax anything or anyone out of business. You just can't. Including if the states could tax the federal government spending, they could. Now, the reason they wanted to tax them was get rid of the bank is kind of interesting though, is because it was, what they did was the federal government came in and basically they were setting up these banks so they could lend money to people. Okay, lend money to build things for whatever the federal government was going to do, you know, to handle federal business. Well, the problem was is it was really, really, really corrupt. Okay, so Maryland was like, and so what happened was is Maryland started putting all these restrictions, state restrictions on the federal bank. They said, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. And they were all reasonable under the circumstances because they were all stop corrupt acts. And so there were fines for doing this and the whole thing. And it was messy. I mean, it was really, really corrupt. They found a couple of people at the top were just, you know, just stashing away cash. And, you know, the Maryland was pretty unhappy about it and things of that nature. So they bring this case, right? And they say, hey, what's going on here? First of all, it doesn't say in the Constitution that the federal government can even have a bank, right? And so they go through that analysis. What happens very shortly after this is, because we know that they said they could, but what happens after this is the charter of the bank only goes for 10 years, then it has to be renewed. They renew it at the end of this 10-year period, but then when it came up again, Andrew Jackson was president. He said, no way, this is federalism at its worst. And he actually refuses to sign the charter. And since that day, we've never had a federal bank. Now, why I tell you that is because there are, you know, there's always rumors they're going to start a federal bank. Question is in this class, can they do that? The answer is yes. It's said they can't. The only reason we don't have a federal banking system today is because of Andrew Jackson. He was all for states' rights. He didn't want the federal. So he's just thought it was nonsensical, refused to sign the charter, and we went into business. Yeah. Now, the second part of this case, though, which is also very interesting, is the power to tax and spend, right? And so at this time, we didn't really, again, know what they could do to each other. We knew the federal government could tax, we knew the states could tax, we knew there was an interplay between the two. But somebody had to figure out what they could do and what they couldn't do. Power to tax, very powerful. It's really, you know, a lot of people in government don't have that power, and there's very good reasons for that. You can raise money, but you know it's easy to destroy your enemies too. Just tax them out of business. And so they've got to figure out what they can do here, because again, they've got to do something because Maryland is threatening just to tax them out of existence anyway. Again, it doesn't make any sense to do that because they've already said they can have the bank. So you see, they have to figure this out. And in this case, they just say, well, this is a situation where there's just going to have to be some kind of balance between the two. We understand you can both tax. That's not the problem. But they sort of come up with some basic ideas of, you know, governmental immunities when the federal can tax the state and the state can tax the federal. And they're both in places. There's lots of laws about both of them right now, when they can do that. So it's pretty interesting stuff. The question becomes, so they decide that in fact they can have the bank and that no, they can't tax them out of existence. So now we have more about that dual sovereignty, which is interesting. You know, we're learning more about that in America. But again, it is an interesting story because it was in 19, that can't be right. I've got that date. It's 1819.
Yeah, it's 1819.
Sorry about 1919, Woodrow Wilson was president, and I know sure as hell he didn't do anything with this. Anyway, so 1818. So by 1826, though, the bank is kaput, just so you know. It didn't make it into the 1830s. So that's kind of the moral of the story. But again, it shows you it's a very interesting case because it really shows you, particularly when we're talking about Congress, and this will become very important next week. And just remember, Commerce Clause is one of the most asked questions on the bar. And there's always multi-states on it, guaranteed. I don't think there ever will be a bar that there's not questions about it. So next week, Commerce Clause gives you a lot of heads up on how we work with these enumerated powers. Yeah. Sound good? Yes. Okay, is there anything else I can answer for you today? No? Okay then, let's call it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Drucker.
Hmm?
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure. I love it when you all ingratiate me.
No, but I did.
I'm glad you did it, because I was about to ask him, and I was like, I don't wanna let down.
When it's fine.
There will be a binder next time.
It's okay.
So you don't want that, is what you're saying?
I probably will lose. That would not be in your best interest. I'll probably say something to you like, what's a brief? Bad. All right, guys. Woohoo, we're on our way in con law, huh?
But now you have me trying to figure out which one of those two the abortion thing goes for. So
Oh,
now,
yeah, it's,
so now I'm sitting here literally reading section 8 going, alright, Congress has the power to legislate.
yeah.
Is this a tax code?
Well, that's one of the things about, again, I'm telling you guys, you will, every con law student does it to some degree, whether they like the class or not. But you start to look around and you start to wonder, how do they do that? I mean, you really do. And it's like, that doesn't make any sense. They have two powers and yet they're doing this, they're doing that. That doesn't make any sense at all.
No,
And you're right, it doesn't. But I'll tell you why we do it, which is even better. And what's the actual answer? Because the Supreme Court said it.
Yeah, right.
There you go. All right.
Nice.
Bye, thank you.